Hey there, podcast maniacs. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're tackling a topic that's kind of close to home for everyone.
Yeah, in a way we're going to be exploring the future of aging.
It's a big one, that's for sure, and we're going to be looking at it from a global perspective. Not just, the numbers and stuff, but also how aging populations are impacting economies, societies, even human rights. It's a really fascinating area.
It is, and to guide our deep dive, we've got a whole bunch of sources. We've got UN reports giving us the global overview, OECD data that goes deep on long-term care, this super interesting IDB publication that zooms in on Latin America and the Caribbean.
Right.
And even a sneak peek into what healthcare innovations ROS Plus is cooking up.
It's amazing, you look at all these different sources coming from all over the place, and they all kind of point to the same thing. The world is getting older and fast. We need to figure out how to adapt, and it's not going to be easy. Right. And that's kind of our mission today. Uncovering the most interesting, most surprising insights from all these sources. How are different regions of the world dealing with this massive demographic shift? What are the challenges, and I guess what are the unexpected upsides? Because there have to be some, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are always upsides, even when things seem a bit, daunting. But let's start with some global context. The UN data is pretty stark. By 2030, get this, the number of people aged 60 and over will be over 1.4 billion. That's a 64% increase from just 2015. It's huge.
Yeah, 64%. That's mind-blowing. It's almost like, the whole world's about to have a giant retirement party, huh? But what's really interesting to me, man, I know we're going to get into this later, but Latin America, they're aging even faster than other parts of the world. Now, Europe, that's the older continent right now.
That's right.
But Latin America, they're catching up quick. What's behind that accelerated aging?
Well, a few things, really. One is the birth rate. It's been dropping like crazy in Latin America and the Caribbean over the past few decades, meaning fewer young people are coming into the population.
Makes sense. Fewer babies, older average age. Pretty straightforward math there. Anything else contributing to this trend?
Yeah, actually, healthcare and living conditions, they've been getting better, which is great. People are living longer, healthier lives. And that, of course, contributes to the aging of the population overall.
So it's like a good news, bad news kind of situation. Longer lives are amazing, but it definitely creates new challenges. So what's the economic impact of this rapid aging in Latin America? Because you always hear about a shrinking workforce being a big problem, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. But here's the thing. It could actually be an opportunity. Think about it. Fewer people entering the workforce could mean higher wages for those who are working, leading to more savings. And those savings, they could be invested, boosting economic growth in new ways. Of course, this requires careful planning and smart policies, but the potential is there.
So a shrinking workforce doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. It's interesting to see how this could actually flip into a positive. Are there other economic ripple effects we should be aware of?
Absolutely. Fewer kids means less pressure on education funding, right? That could free up resources to improve the quality of education, focus on developing those really in-demand skills, getting people ready for a world where technology and automation are only going to get bigger.
So potentially better education, that's a definite plus. But let's be real, the big worry is the strain on pensions and healthcare, right? These systems, they were built for a younger population. Can they really handle this wave of older folks coming through? Is that even sustainable in the long run?
That is the million-dollar question. And honestly, it's something that's keeping policymakers up at night over the world. It's pretty clear that the old models need an overhaul. We got to rethink pensions, healthcare, the whole shebang, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of challenges, and I know this OECD report digs into this pretty deep, there's this whole looming worker shortage in long-term care. And that's happening just as demand for these services is about to explode. So what's the deal with long-term care? What are we missing here?
Well, the OECD report highlights some things that people don't often talk about, like working conditions in long-term care. They can be pretty rough, low pay, not much respect. It's not exactly a glamorous job. So it's really tough to attract and keep qualified caregivers.
It's like a vicious cycle, right? The worse the conditions, the harder it is to find people who want to do the work.
Exactly, and that shortage puts a ton of pressure on informal caregivers, family members, friends. The report says something like 1 in 8 people over 50 in OECD countries are providing informal care.
Wow, 1 in 8. That's a huge number of people trying to juggle caregiving with their own lives. It's got to be incredibly stressful.
Oh, absolutely. The report talks about the mental health strain, the difficulty balancing work and caregiving, the emotional toll. It's a lot.
So it sounds like a pretty dire situation. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel here? What are the options?
Well, the OECD report, it actually suggests that investing in long-term care systems could be a win-win. It could boost labor participation, especially for women who are often the primary caregivers. And more people working means a stronger pension system in the long run.
So it's not just about addressing an immediate need, but also setting things up for a more sustainable future. That's a pretty compelling argument. Are there any countries that are actually getting this right?
Yeah, South Korea and Uruguay are doing some interesting things. They've been investing in long-term care, improving working conditions, and they've created millions of formal, decent-paying jobs. It proves that this challenge, it can be turned into an opportunity.
That's good to hear. Some good news for a change. So let's zoom in a bit now and talk about Latin America and the Caribbean specifically. We've got this IDB publication that dives deep into the region's unique aging challenges. What's the overall picture?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Living standards for older adults have been improving, which is great. More people are entering the middle class. But there are still some pretty big disparities within the region.
So progress is being made, but it's not reaching everyone equally. Could you give us an example of what you mean by these disparities?
Yeah, look at Uruguay, for instance. Over 80% of older adults there are considered middle class. But in countries like Guatemala and Honduras, it's less than 20%.
Wow, that's a huge difference. What's driving that gap?
Well, the IDB report links it to education levels and poverty rates among older adults. It basically says we need policies that address those root causes. It's not enough to just focus on overall economic growth. We have to make sure older adults are benefiting too.
So a more targeted approach is needed. Makes sense. Now, we had to talk about healthcare systems. I mean, they're already stretched thin in many places. And with this wave of older folks coming through, it seems like they're going to be under immense pressure.
No doubt about it. And the old model of healthcare, focused on acute care, treating immediate illnesses, that is not going to cut it for an aging population.
So what needs to change? How do we make healthcare systems work for older people?
Well, the focus needs to shift. We got to move from acute care to managing chronic conditions. As people get older, they're more likely to have multiple health issues that need ongoing care. It's a different ballgame.
Right, so it's less about fixing things when they break down and more about preventing things from breaking down in the first place. Are there specific challenges to making this shift in Latin America and the Caribbean?
The IDB report, it points out a big one, and that's the lack of consistent assessment. Basically, different countries have different ways of figuring out who needs what kind of care. It's all over the place, which makes it harder to deliver care effectively and fairly.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare. Any bright spots? Are there any countries doing this well?
Uruguay, again, they're doing some good things. They have a unified assessment system. It makes things much smoother and fairer when it comes to figuring out who needs what.
So it looks like Uruguay is kind of a model student when it comes to aging. But what about the cost of all this? Healthcare is expensive everywhere, but especially in places where resources are already limited. How are countries in Latin America and the Caribbean dealing with that?
It's tough, no question. Economic growth and rising demand for services, those are definitely pushing costs up. But new technology, it's also a factor. And it's a double-edged sword. It can improve care, but it often comes with a hefty price tag.
So it's like this constant balancing act, wanting to provide the best care possible, but also having to deal with budget realities. How are they managing?
Well, the IDB report, it's not all sunshine and roses. It points out that care systems in the region are often underdeveloped and coverage is low, which means spending on long-term care is also low. There's definitely been some progress, but more investment is needed to make sure older adults get the support they deserve.
It's a sobering thought. Economic growth alone isn't enough. We have to make sure our healthcare systems can keep up with the needs of an aging population.
As we're talking about all these economic challenges and healthcare systems, we can't forget about something super important: social protection. It's kind of the glue that holds everything together for older adults, don't you think?
Yeah, totally. When you think about the health issues, maybe financial worries, maybe even loneliness that can come with aging, a good social safety net, it's like a lifeline.
Absolutely. And, the CEPOL publication we have, it really drives that point home. It goes as far as to say that a strong social protection system isn't just some policy choice. It's a fundamental human right for older adults.
Wow, a human right. That's a pretty strong statement. So what does that look like in practice? What are the must-haves for a social protection system that truly works for older folks?
Well, CEPOL breaks it down into three main pillars. Pensions, of course, to make sure people have some financial security. Basic health care, gotta have that. And then care for autonomy, which is all about helping people maintain their independence and dignity as they get older.
Makes sense. Those three pillars, they cover a lot of ground. But, you look at the UN's goal of universal social protection by 2030, that's only a few years away. It seems like a pretty ambitious target. What are the biggest obstacles we're up against?
Yeah, CEPOL acknowledges the challenges, for sure. One of the biggest things they point out is that a huge number of older adults, particularly women, indigenous people, and folks living in rural areas, they just don't have access to pensions. It's a recipe for poverty and insecurity, really.
It's a sad reminder that progress doesn't always reach everyone equally. Those who are already struggling, they tend to get left behind. Why is it so hard to get pensions to these groups? What's going on there?
It's complicated, a lot of factors at play. For women, it's often about career gaps, taking time off for caregiving or working lower paying jobs. That translates to less money going into pensions over their lifetime. And for indigenous communities and rural populations, well, they often face systemic barriers to getting formal jobs, to even accessing the Social Security system in the first place.
It's like a double whammy, right? Not only is the coverage lacking, but the system itself might not be set up to include them in the first place.
Exactly. And even when we're talking about people who are in the formal workforce, you find huge differences in Social Security benefits, who qualifies, all that stuff. It really varies depending on where you live, which tells you it's a system-wide problem. It's not enough to just tweak things here and there. We need a more fundamental fix to ensure everyone's got at least a basic safety net.
So it sounds like we need a more comprehensive approach, one that fills those coverage gaps, but also tackles the underlying inequality that's built into the system. What can we do about this pension crisis? Any innovative ideas out there, especially for people who fall through the cracks of the traditional system?
Oh, definitely. The IDB publication had some interesting ideas about this. It actually focused on the challenges faced by workers in the informal sector. Self-employed folks, freelancers, gig workers, those who don't have a typical employer-based pension plan.
That's a massive part of the workforce, particularly in developing countries. We can't leave them out of the equation. What kind of solutions are being proposed for them?
One thing that caught my eye was leveraging behavioral economics, basically shifting from a voluntary pension contribution system to an automatic enrollment system.
Automatic enrollment. It makes sense in a way, but doesn't that raise questions about individual choice, about people being in control of their own money?
It's not about forcing people, it's about giving them a nudge in the right direction, and they can always opt out if they want to. Studies show that automatic enrollment dramatically increases participation rates compared to those opt-in schemes. People, they tend to stick with whatever the default is, even if they have the option to change it.
Yeah, I can see that. Inertia can be a powerful force, especially when it comes to things like financial planning. Any other behavioral economics tricks we can use to get people saving more?
Well, the IDB talked about making the process as seamless as possible. Imagine, integrating pension contributions with your tax return, or maybe even paying it with your utility bill. By weaving it into things people are already doing, it's less of a hurdle.
It's like that set it and forget it mentality applied to retirement planning.
Exactly. And technology can play a huge role here. Mobile banking, online platforms, even micro pension schemes. All these innovations can make pensions more accessible to people who have been traditionally left out.
These sound like real game changers for social protection. Now let's go back to the CPEL publication for a bit. I'm really intrigued by their emphasis on a human rights-based approach to aging. It seems like a real departure from how we typically think about aging.
Yeah, it's a real paradigm shift. It's about moving away from that old deficit model of aging, the one that paints older people as burdens, focusing on all their needs and limitations.
Right, that whole narrative that aging populations are just a drain on resources, a problem to be solved. How does the human rights perspective challenge that?
It flips the script completely. It says that older people have the same rights and freedoms as everyone else. It's about equality, non-discrimination. It's about empowering people, not treating them like they're helpless.
So it's about recognizing that they have agency, that they can still contribute to society, even if they need some extra support in certain areas.
Exactly, and we're actually seeing this reflected in some recent legal frameworks specifically designed to protect older adults. There's the Inter-American Convention, the African Charter Protocol, and the Council of Europe recommendation. All these are concrete steps towards acknowledging and upholding the rights of older people.
It's great to see those legal protections coming into play, but how do we make sure those principles translate into real-world action? How do we make sure older adults actually have autonomy and control over their lives, even as they might need some assistance?
This is where the idea of supported decision-making comes in. It's a totally different approach from the old way of doing things, guardianship, where decisions are made for older people, often based on assumptions about their capabilities.
So it's about empowering them to make their own choices, even if they need a little help along the way.
Exactly. It's about recognizing their dignity and their capacity, even if they need help understanding information, expressing their wishes, or navigating tricky situations.
It's about having the right support systems in place, making sure their voices are heard and their choices are respected.
Absolutely, and this leads to a really interesting concept that CPEL talks about, interdependence. It's basically saying that the relationship between older people and society, it's not a one-way street.
Interdependence, that's an interesting way to put it. I'm curious, What does that actually mean in practice?
It means recognizing that even though older adults might need support in certain areas, they also have a lot to offer. They have knowledge, skills, experience. They're assets to their families, communities, society as a whole.
It's a beautiful concept, really. It highlights the interconnectedness of things, that we all rely on each other in different ways.
Exactly. And this idea of interdependence, it's key to building intergenerational solidarity. It's about creating a society where different age groups, they don't just coexist, but they actually interact, collaborate, and support each other.
It's like breaking down those walls that separate generations, realizing that we all have something to offer, something to learn, no matter our age.
Exactly. Imagine communities that are designed for people of all ages, where older adults can easily get around, access services, participate in things. Think about workplaces that value the experience of older workers, offering flexibility so they can keep contributing.
It's about letting people age in place, in their own communities, surrounded by people they know, with support systems in place.
And it's about creating opportunities for different generations to connect. Mentorship programs, community projects, things that let younger generations learn from the wisdom of their elders and give older adults a sense of purpose, a way to stay connected.
It's like a fundamental shift, right? Moving away from segregating people by age and towards a more inclusive, supportive model.
Exactly. And that shift, it impacts everything, how we design our cities, our policies, even our own personal attitudes towards aging. So we've talked a lot about the challenges, but, creating a society that truly values and supports its aging population, that's not just about fixing problems, it's about having a vision, seeing aging not as something to be managed, but as a natural part of life, a chapter with its own possibilities.
Right, like adding life to years, not just years to life. I like that. But what does that actually look like in the real world? How do we move from talking about active aging to actually making it happen?
Well, imagine this. Communities that are designed with accessibility in mind. So older adults can get around easily, use public transport, participate in things without running into a bunch of obstacles. And workplaces that recognize the value of experience, offering flexible arrangements for older workers so they can contribute their skills while still having that work-life balance.
Yeah, aging in place in your own community, surrounded by familiar faces, that's a powerful idea. You're not isolated, you're still part of things.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the physical environment. We got to create opportunities for different generations to connect, break down those age barriers. Think about things like mentorship programs where retirees can share their knowledge with younger folks, or community gardens where everyone, young and old, can work together.
I love that. It's about recognizing that every generation has something unique to offer, something to learn from each other.
Exactly. It's about building a culture of mutual respect and understanding. Seeing aging not as some kind of decline, but as a transition, a new chapter with its own opportunities and, maybe some challenges too.
Right, and how do we as individuals play a role in all of this? It's one thing to talk about policies and infrastructure, but it seems like it also requires a shift in our own mindsets, right?
It all starts with looking inward, challenging our own biases. Ask yourself, how do I see older people? Do I see them as active members of society, or do I kind of write them off? Do I value their experiences, their contributions?
Yeah, it's about recognizing that age is just a number, and we all have something to offer, no matter how many birthdays we've had.
That's it. And it's about staying engaged with life, Keep learning, keep growing, keep contributing. Aging doesn't mean giving up on those things. It can mean discovering new passions, exploring new things, making a difference.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. It's like we've been so focused on the problems of aging that we've kind of missed the bigger picture.
Yeah, and the potential, the contributions that older adults can make. It's important to remember that the future of aging, it's not set in stone. We're creating it right now. And if we embrace these ideas of interdependence, inclusion, dignity, we can build a future where aging is something to be celebrated, not feared.
Well said. Podcast Maniacs, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the future of aging after this deep dive. We've got some work to do, for sure, but the possibilities are definitely exciting.
And we'll leave you with this. Think about how you can bring this idea of interdependence to life in your own community and your own interactions. How can you bridge those generational gaps? We'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences in the comments below.
And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, give it a like, subscribe to The Deep Dive for more awesome content, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Until next time, Podcast Maniacs, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.